about good, bad, or in between.
Yeah, amazing. Oh, and I also wanted to say, congratulations on your wedding. I know obviously COVID is a crazy time to get married, but I had Paulina on the podcast too. She's delightful, man. So
Oh, did
congratulations.
she come on? I didn't know that.
Yeah, she was on about a month and a half ago.
She's the best. I'm
Yeah,
biased,
really
but she's
cool.
the best.
Yeah, that's great, man. So congratulations.
I appreciate that very much.
Great. Well, Anthony, we're recording. I can call you Pomp, right? That's
Call me whatever you want.
all right. Great. Well, Pomp, thank you so much for being on my show. I'm a fan of your work. I've been reading your newsletter for years, actually. It started, I wrote a blog post on my website about how to start a paid newsletter. I had Hamish McKenzie on my show probably like a year ago. And in that article, it still ranks #1 for start a paid newsletter, but I used your newsletter as an example.
I
And
appreciate
over
that.
the last year and a half, you've continued to grow leaps and bounds. And so congratulations to all your success. We were talking a little bit before we started recording about how I planned out where I was going to take this conversation, but within the last day, you have released a new podcast, Capital University. It shot up to be the #1 podcast in the world. And so I think the easiest way, and for me personally, the thing that I'm like most curious about is, one, where did the idea for this podcast even come into play? I think it's a great concept, teaching financial literacy to the younger audience. And two, from more of like a media marketing standpoint, like how did you work these angles about getting some of these influencers involved to have this huge jump in promotion?
Yeah. So I've always had this idea that getting people outside of the finance world, like more kind of in the culture, if you will, involved in financial literacy and education would drastically accelerate our ability to just get people interested, right? Just teach them, how does money work? What should you understand? And to me, education is like the great equalizer, right? It's if you give people the information, at least now they're playing on the same kind of informational playing field, and therefore they can kind of start making sound decisions and put themselves in a position to be successful. But it's really hard. Like, nobody wants the finance crowd to come and give them financial education, right? Nobody wants their teacher to give that information either, really. And so it's always like, how do you get athletes or musicians or influencers, et cetera? And so I reached out to a friend, Michael Gruen, and I said to him, hey, this is maybe, I don't know, 6 months ago, maybe even a year ago. And I said, hey, man, you manage a bunch of these TikTok stars. Like, what if we tried to do something there? And at the time, it was kind of like, I don't think that he necessarily was sold on it. But he was like, let me think about it. And, I'll come back to you if anything makes sense. So, kind of we went nowhere with it. And then recently he introduced me to a bunch of these guys and was like, hey, look, they're starting to get interested in investing. Like, why don't you just jump on a call with them and kind of talk it through? And so got on a call, and I was actually very positively surprised. One, I think just by how hard these guys are working. Also I think just in their ambitions, right? That they really do see this as an opportunity. And they were saying things like, look, 70% of athletes go broke right after they're done playing. Like, we're kind of the modern day athlete, where you're young, you walk into kind of a situation where you can go from nothing to a bunch of money. And we don't want to end up like that. Right. And so, like, help us understand how to invest and what we should be thinking about, whatever. And so it became very clear very quickly, like, if we're going to have these conversations, on a periodic basis, like, why don't we just record them? So everybody who looks up to you can also get that information. And I think part of it was like Bryce Hall specifically should get a lot of credit for this, where he has already made a bunch of moves, right? So before I ever even met him, he had already put together a merchandise line. He had already set up a energy drink company with one of his friends, Josh Richards. And so, like, they were kind of making all of the directionally right moves. But it was a thing where it's like, hey, if you kind of go and do this without the knowledge and the mentorship, like, you're probably just going to make the same mistakes everyone makes, right? But could we actually, like, accelerate your learning and increase the probability of success for you by getting you in front of the people who are the best in the world at doing some of this stuff? And so really the idea for the podcast was like, could I basically help Bryce kind of navigate some of this, but not that I know all the answers, right? Actually, in a lot of cases, I don't know the answers. And so could I bring in people that I knew, whether it was investors or entrepreneurs, to basically help mentor live, one of the people that has the largest audience for kind of this new generation. And so, we released the first podcast episode. We can get into kind of what that release strategy was like and everything, but it exploded. And I think one of the pieces of information or data points that we've gotten already that I was telling my wife Polina about that I'm just proud of, right? Is we already see kids saying things like, I can't wait to learn about business. I never thought I would care about this, but like now that Bryce is doing it, like I'm so excited to learn. And it's just, I don't know if we'll be successful in actually teaching them, but just the fact that like we can create the excitement around them, we can expose kids to these ideas, I think is really important. So that's really cool to see. And then also there's a huge component of this of like where I'm basically doing my best to bring other people in, right? So between myself, Michael, and a few other people who are helping, we're really trying to get the best of the best. And so the second episode that we're releasing is with Mark Cuban, right? Mark doesn't need to come and do this, right? But he wants to, one, help Bryce, but also two, he understands kind of the impact it can have. And we've got a whole list of guests that are kind of lined up that will come on at kind of after Mark. But I think that's the general idea behind it. And so far so good, but as with many things, you know, we're less than a week into it, so you don't want to get too excited. You know, it's really kind of not who's the fastest in the beginning, it's just kind of who's left standing, right?
Sure. Okay, I'm going to go off on a little bit of a rabbit hole because I think this message is very important. With social media, I personally feel that there's a perception that entrepreneurship is everywhere, right? But the numbers actually don't say that. The numbers say that there's less companies being started now than there were before. There's fewer and fewer people putting their money back into whether hard assets or soft assets or things that can just provide money for them in the future so that they're not spending their whole lives working. So like I'm saying that as a little bit of a catalyst to say that this message is something that is really, really, really important because like you said, making money is difficult enough, but learning, and this is a big lesson for me when I had Sean Purry, who I know that you know on my podcast a little bit ago, we were kind of talking about that realization that money isn't necessarily like a thing that you need. It's like just a thing that you use, right? It's not something that you save. It's like a tool more than anything. And once I personally had that transition in my mind from reading people like you, I read a lot of Ramit Sethi. That's like such an important mental block that I worry young people don't have. And there's no one there teaching them. We still don't learn it in school, even though, you know, the whole idea of like a 30-year mortgage and just the whole idea of like staying in one job your whole life, like that's gone, you know? And so like we need to really catch up with the times and just teach the next generation. If you don't start treating your money as a tool and figuring out places to put it, places to invest in your future self, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So this is like an open-ended question. I'm kind of just giving you an opportunity to kind of rant a little bit about this mission that I know you have and the message that you're trying to spread.
Yeah, look, I think ultimately what you end up getting is you have a system where I don't joke, but I say all the time that kind of the rich get richer, the poor get poorer.
Yeah.
And it's really like a wealth conversation. But ultimately, when you peel that back, the joke is it's not so much about your wealth status as much as it's about your education status. And what I mean by that is, yes, there's always outliers, right? If you're born into a family that's got a bunch of money, like you got to be an idiot to not be rich by the time you die, right? Like all that kind of stuff for sure that exists. But for the average person who's not born into money, who's not kind of put into one of these situations, what ends up occurring is it really is a divide between those who are educated on how money works and kind of finances and those who are not. And so the perfect example is, look at what's happening right now. So anytime you get kind of manipulation or intervention by a central bank in any economy around the world, not just the United States, what you see is the system does exactly what it's designed to do, right? The system actually operates really well for what it's supposed to do. And that is it will punish savers and it will reward investors, right? The whole idea of inflation is to get you out of the currency, either consume or invest rather than hold the currency. And so just that simple idea, which is like literally economics 101 or, personal finance 101 of like invest, don't save type stuff, that is life-changing for people, right? And so it's one thing for like me to go and tweet, invest, don't save. Sure, the finance crowd, they love that. It's like, oh, this simple thing, whatever. A 22-year-old kid could care less about that, right? That 22-year-old kid wants to know, wait a second, you're telling me that rather than have my money sit in my bank account and it just stays equal, right? I could invest in things and it could grow and I could get rich, right? Like you got to remember that at, 15, 17, 20, 22, even at 30, people think very, very differently than when you're 45, 50 years old. And so I think that's a huge component of this. And then you get into like the more nuanced stuff, right? Like there's this idea, I think that people have around like investing, right? And what I always talk with my friends about is like the stock market's just a legal casino. That's all that's going on, right? And traders, that's just a nice fancy word for gamblers, right?
Betters.
Yeah, but that's okay. What you as a investor need to understand is you don't want to be that gambler, right? You don't want to be that bettor. Instead, there's basically a bet, right? Or kind of an opportunity that always works, right? And so imagine if you were a gambler and you knew every time the team that was going to win, then you would of course go bet on that team every time, right? And you would just figure out, how do I put more money on that team? And so that's the same thing that happens with asset prices over long periods of time. Is we devalue the currencies and asset prices go up. We know that that will happen regardless, right? Because the dollar's being devalued in purchasing power terms. And so it's little things like that, again, where you can kind of put it in terms for younger people that it starts to resonate. And again, they're going to make all the mistakes. They're going to do all these different things, but it's simply making it cool to care about this stuff. And you know, I'm always careful to say that like, this is not a new idea. This is not my idea. Like there are way many more people than me that have come before me that have worked on this stuff. And so if you look at like just Robert Kiyosaki, for example, with Rich Dad Poor Dad, he built this massive business. It's the best-selling personal finance book in the world. But he told a story and he made it entertaining, right?
Yeah.
And like, that's why it worked. He created a board game, like all that kind of stuff. Then you look at even people that are kind of less finance and more kind of from music or culture. Take Jay-Z, for example, right? If you go back and you listen to some of the lyrics in like the 444 album that he put out, what you hear is him saying things like, I had an opportunity to buy that building in Dumbo, right? At a certain price. And then it appreciated like 4 or 5X. I didn't do it. Like now who's the Dumbo? Right. And so you kind of just realize like, wait a second, this guy is literally explaining financial education. He may not even think he's doing that, but he's talking about money in a way that kind of sensationalizes or celebrates, hey, you can be an investor and you can grow wealth. And I think that that's what we need to kind of really make a dent in this problem. And so, you know, kudos to Bryce and Josh Richards, Griffin Johnson, all these guys on TikTok. They're interested in doing it. I'm happy to really just facilitate it because they're the ones who are doing the work, and they're the ones who are kind of have the ear of an entire generation. So it's pretty cool to see.
That's amazing. And I'm not really a social media person. I like Twitter and I'm just comfortable on Twitter. And in my view, it's still just like the best memes, the funnest place to be, the best friends, you know, so I can't really speak to TikTok. With that being said, obviously it's got a lot of power, and more importantly, what I'm trying to get at is I breezed through the show. You mentioned Bryce Hall. So just for listeners, before we move on to the next subject, like give me a little bit of the people involved, where they come from, where their audience is from, and like the direction that you guys are going in terms of like a media entity.
Yeah. So in terms of Capital University, the co-hosts are myself and Bryce Hall. Bryce is a 21-year-old. I call him a social media star. Other people would call him a TikTok influencer. He always likes to say that he is not a TikTok influencer or social media influencer. He's more of an entertainer. So kind of use whatever vernacular you want there. But Bryce has got an audience of about 30 million followers across social media platforms. Some of this is, you know, kind of a big following, call it, you know, 15, 20 million, whatever it is on TikTok. But also he's got 3 million YouTube subscribers. He's got, you know, over 1 million people on Twitter. He's got a very large Instagram audience. So he's kind of done a good job of kind of spreading out across the platforms and de-risking some of the platform risk. But also then he's built these businesses, and some of the businesses he's done kind of more solo, and others he's worked with other people kind of in his circle, right? So Josh Richards is another one. I think he's got almost 40 million followers. Griffin Johnson is another one. And so you start to just like think through this, and you're like, look, these audiences are not only one massive, but two, they're heavily engaged, right? The other day, Bryce posted an Instagram photo, and I just happened to be on Instagram, and it was 58 minutes after the post. He had 220,000 likes on it. And I'm like, you know,
So silly.
I I don't have a friend that can do that, right? So like,
Yeah.
he's got a bigger audience than any friend I have. And so the way that I think about this is, although Bryce and I are the co-host, there's the opportunity to bring on kind of the really kind of smart, successful, entrepreneurs and investors like the Mark Cubans of the world. But also we've got an episode that we've recorded where he was able to bring on Josh Richards, who's another kind of guy in his group, and they're the ones who are building an energy drink company together called Annie. And so what ends up happening is now we've got two of the most successful, kind of most sought after stars for this generation on the same podcast together. It's because they're friends, right? And then we can kind of go and get other influencers, other people who want to be a part of this. And so when you kind of see the way that this works, what you realize is they serve as a magnet, not only for the audience, but also for guests as well. And again, to me, like I almost feel like the referee a little bit of just like, hey, let's get Bryce on with really, really smart people and have him go into the episode with a certain kind of topic or angle, and then just learn, right? And I tell them before every episode, I say, listen, man, if you're just authentic and you genuinely learn here, everyone else is going to learn, right? Don't kind of put on a show. Don't just learn. And the key is having the right guests and all this kind of stuff. And so I think that what we're starting to see is not only the kind of excitement around the show, but also all of a sudden, what do we see? A bunch of other people that are kind of around him or look up to him. They start talking about money, finance, wealth, right? All this kind of stuff. And the last thing I'll leave you with is I joke all the time with some of the other guys. I used this term one time called generational wealth, right? And I think they were kind of like, what is that or whatever. And then I saw a couple of them use it. And so I messaged them and I was like, hey, keep using that term, generational wealth. Because one, that's the ultimate goal, right? But also two is the business world will respect you when you have that type of ambition, right? And they'll understand, oh, okay, these guys aren't just trying to make, 100 grand so they can go out and party, right? They're looking at this completely different. And I think what I'm hoping to help these guys do, but ultimately it's up to them and kind of their aspirations and their hard work and persistence here is, can we take, people who have large social media audiences and are looked at as kind of influencers today, and can we transition them to now you say not Bryce Hall, the social media star, but Bryce Hall, the entrepreneur, or Bryce Hall, the businessman, right? And that's not going to happen overnight. That's, many, many years in the making. But I think generally starting that now and being able to document that process, hopefully will be really, 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 really valuable to other people.
I think it's very smart. It's very exciting. And again, just to kind of reiterate, it's really important. There's just a difference between being 35, being 45, and being 21. And like, you just don't know it. And if you're 21 and listen to this, like, you're just kind of dumb, and it's nothing personal. Like, I was just as dumb, like, it's fine. And so just how you were talking about the idea of using that term, generational wealth, like, it excites me to know that because of this podcast over the next year, 2 years, however long you guys run with it, like, there's going to be conversations online on Twitter with young people that are actually just talking about things that it took me way too long to learn. Even just the idea of like compounding or just the idea of inflation. Like, you hear about it in history class, but you never actually understand what that means from a practical level. Like, no, the money that's just sitting in your bank account is getting less and less valuable every day. And so teaching people that there's things that you can do to invest in your future self like that, I'm excited that you have such a role in that. And I just think it's going to, and also I think it's really, really going to catch on. I think there's like a huge market for that conversation. And I just think you guys are going to kill it. So congratulations on all that.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate you letting me talk about it as well.
Great. Okay. I want to transition a little bit to your newsletter. The majority of people that listen to me are writers. I still, even with social media and with video and all the different ways to create content, I still personally feel that being a strong writer is like the best foundation for building an online business. I've always felt that way. I think that'll probably always be the case for many, many reasons. So your newsletter, it's a daily finance newsletter. It's subscription based. It's now just called the Pomp Letter. I think it was called off the chain, right? Before I tell everybody basically what it is, why don't you tell us how you got the idea for it? And more importantly, what I want to know from my own personal sake is building a subscription based on a newsletter is like a very daunting challenge. You know, it's really easy to say like, oh, I'm just going to write every day and build a following. But then 5 months into it, you're like, oh shit, no one's really watching me. You know, like how do you keep going year after year? Just tell me about your journey with that.
Yeah, I could take zero credit for the idea to do this. So my wife used to work at Fortune magazine. She wrote a daily email that basically covered tech and venture capital. It
Mm.
was very, very widely read across kind of the entire industry. It was kind of seen as one of the core sources of information. And I saw her write it every day. And I, in the past, have spent kind of in spurts, written for long periods of time, then stopped, then written, for long periods of time, and then stopped. And we were on a flight back from a trip we took, and we were just sitting there talking, and she basically was like harassing me into like, you should do this. Like there's an entire new industry. No one's doing this yet. Like you should do this. And I was like, I don't know. And she's like, just get started. Like she knows me well enough where she's like, if I wait and I think about it, I won't do it. But if I just start, then I'm pretty persistent with things. And so I think either on the flight or like shortly after we got back, I set up Substack. I think I was like one of the very early users there. And what I liked about it was that you could have this like paid component and also a free component, right? And I had no clue if that would work or not, but it was just like, let's just see what happens. Now, one of the benefits I had was I had this massive Twitter audience already, right? And so I was able to kind of leverage, can I take some of the Twitter audience and move them to an email, right? And part of this also in the back of my head was like, there's platform risk with only having Twitter. So like, what's the platform you can bring people to and you own the relationship with them, or at least as much as you can. And so that definitely played into it as well. And then I just started. And what's so funny about it is like, if you go back and you look, like it's generally the same idea, but like I've added things over time. They've gotten a little longer, all the process has changed and kind of how I write them, all that kind of stuff. It really was just like, once I got started, I think I had maybe, I don't know, maybe 100 people sign up as a paying member to start. And like, there's some people who hear that and they're like, oh my God, that's like amazing, right? I wish that I could get to 100 people right out of the gate. For me, it was like, I don't remember how many followers I had, but maybe I had like 150,000 followers. And I was kind of like, oh, only 100 people, like that's like a really low conversion rate, right? And so it was like very kind of, is this going to work or is it not? And I just said to myself, I'm going to try it for 6 months, right? Because I think I started in May of 2018. So it was like basically through the end of the year, 7 months, whatever it was. And as I started to go, it became very obvious that I was learning because it was forcing me to write something every day. Two was the conversations that I was having with people who were subscribed was unlike the conversation on Twitter. So it was much more in-depth. It was much more kind of intellectual, et cetera. And then the third thing was from a monetary standpoint, there was just enough where it was like, so if I got 100 people, like if I get 500 people, let me do that math. If I get 1,000 people, like, let me do that math. Right. And like, again, 1,000 at the time felt like, a mountain to climb, right? Because you're just like, I got a 10x. Like, how the hell am I going to do that? Like, I just shot all my bullets, right? I tweeted it. But at the same time, it was like, okay, like I see a path here. Like, I understand how this business works in terms of you just get people to pay you, right, for the content. And so I think that as it kind of came together, like you mentioned, I changed the name, like some of the content expanded to not just be about Bitcoin, to be about, other things. And so I think my greatest lesson learned, right, like if somebody's listening and they're thinking about this, is like, one, just get started. Two, don't compare like your day one to somebody else's like year 3, 4, 5, whatever, right? It's like my day one and your day one probably look very similar actually. And then the third thing is like, just let the audience kind of take you where they want to go. Right. And it was like, as they said, hey, we really like these type topics, like, can you write more about that? Like, that's what I did. Right. Or if they said, hey, we didn't like that, or it was too long, or it was too short, or, hey, can you add audio? Like, there's all these things that I got feedback for. And I just use it as a learning exercise. Right. And now we are where we are. It's, I think, top 10, top 15, highest grossing, newsletters on Substack. But, a lot of it is just the discipline to do it every day. Like, I've been doing it every day now for 2.5 years. And I'm sure one day I'll wake up and just stop. But other than that, it's just kind of doing it every day and letting it just compound on itself.
I think there's a really funny story here. Again, before we started recording, I let you know that I had Paulina on my podcast, and she was telling me a story about how she went and got coffee with Hamish, and he was like, what are you doing? Like, you want to do this? Why don't you fucking quit your job and do it? And to hear that she was the one nagging at you to start your podcast, that's just that like twist of irony that is always in there, you know?
Well, here's the best part of that. I don't know if she said this part, but I had been encouraging her, I think is probably the right word.
Yeah.
To like, hey, look, if you want to do it, like, do it. And if it doesn't work, like, you can always go back to your job or like find another, you know what I mean? Like it was kind of like, I looked at it much more as like, take the risk. And if it doesn't work, like the worst case scenario is not that bad. Right. I think she was very, just kind of nervous, right? It's like, hey, if you're going to quit your job, you've been there 5 years, like all the things that people know that go into making a career change. Right. And so I called in the cavalry, right? Like Hamish was in town and I was like, hey man, you want to grab coffee? And I actually don't know if I told him I was bringing Polina or not, but when he was there, we were talking about stuff, whatever. And then I brought it up and I was like, hey, Polina, I think should leave. He's like, of course she should. And then she was like, oh my God, like I just got ambushed here by you two. And his perspective was very interesting, right? And I think that this is true again. Like if you're listening to this and you're thinking about doing it, he was like, look, you basically started this while you were at your job, right? So you already had, I think it was 2 years, maybe 3 years. She'd been doing it kind of on the nights and weekends. She built up a pretty good free list, but she had not yet tried to monetize it. And he kind of had two pieces of advice that I found really, really valuable. One, he was like, look, you have people around you, whether it was Hamish and the Substack team, it was me, it was some friends of hers, her family, like all that kind of stuff. They're encouraging you to do this. Like most people are in a situation where actually everyone around them is like discouraging them, right? They're like, oh, don't do that. Like that's so risky, right? Instead, he's like, you have all the tailwinds. You're like, everyone is in support of you doing this. Like you're so lucky, right? So I think that was kind of one key thing. The second thing that was really interesting was this idea that she could turn the paid like monetization on and still stay at her job. Now, maybe they were going to get mad, maybe they weren't, but like just try it. And if a bunch of people sign up, then you'll know like, oh, it's got kind of like the product market fit, right? And you just go full time on it. If it doesn't, then you know that it didn't work and like no harm, no foul. And so in January of this year, she turned it on. And like, again, it was enough traction out of the gate to realize like, hey, here's the path of like how this could be successful. But it wasn't like, oh my God, I could quit today and retire, right? Or like, oh my God, like this is more money than I've ever seen in my life. Like it just wasn't like that. It was still just enough to make it interesting. And like now there's work to be done, but like, am I willing to go do that work? And so what was the most fascinating part about it was she put in her 2-week notice in March of this year. COVID was happening. Oh, yeah. And so it was basically, I don't remember the exact dates, but what I do remember is her last Friday was the Friday when all like the shelter in place orders went in place. So like take somebody who like is literally one of the nicest people in the world. She's already nervous about like leaving her job. And then you throw in like a global pandemic and a potential economic shock on top of it. And she looked at me one day, she's like, I can't leave my job. like this is not good. And so we had a conversation about like, actually now's probably the best time to leave your job. Sure. Right? Like we know that these companies get built. And so I think that, one of the lessons learned that I've had from her, and I think she's had from me also, is like, find people who are like-minded, who you can turn to, right? Us being married obviously is a huge advantage because we're right there, right? We have a very high degree of trust with each other, like all that kind of stuff. But if you can surround yourself with other people who are ambitious, who kind of are doing the same thing, you almost have this like emotional support system. So when you have your moment of like, oh my God, I can't quit my job, you can turn to somebody and they're there and they understand the situation you're in. They understand kind of the pros and cons, and they can have an actual conversation with you. I think people get in a kind of a bad situation when sometimes they turn to people who aren't the best to get advice from, right? And so it's always like, look, the advice you get is important, but usually the advice, who you're getting the advice from is more important, right? And I think that that's just like over time, I think her and I have like really, really honed in on just having those people around you can significantly impact the trajectory of growth when you launch these types of things.
I think that's very accurate. Most people by nature, when they're nervous about doing something, at least I've noticed, I don't have any evidence for this, but they'll also ask people that like they're looking for the practical answer from, because it just kind of, it doubles down on that sort of fear of like, no, let me take the safe road when I mean, look, the truth of the matter is any entrepreneurial journey, you could always fail. And I've been through this experience a million times in my life. And I do think that over time you get more and more comfortable with the idea, because the truth is, like, even the successes aren't really successes. They're just like micro failures, right? It's just like every day you screw up a little bit and you get a little bit better. So, so anybody listening to this, that I think it's actually really good context, because in our conversation, and there is one more thing about the newsletter to bring up, because I know that we're short on time, but I think this is an important topic. We were just talking about this idea of everybody now is just turning into like a one person media entity. And as the economy and as the job market continues to, how do I say, like long tail, you know, like as more and more people get interested in the things that they're interested in, there's more like content and there's more personalities that spread out about like a million different topics. Everybody is going to have an opportunity to be their own little media entity. And that was probably true like 10 years ago, but now even with Substack and even like what ConvertKit's doing, and even WordPress is so much easier to use, right? Like there's never been a better time to just go in on one particular thing that you have a passion with, because if you're excited about it, there's other people that are also excited about it. And it doesn't have to be a million people. Like, you know, like you can have 5,000 people on your list and you're making 60 grand a year. Like that's a great living for just writing some shit that you think is cool anyway, you know? So like I totally encourage that message.
Yeah, I think the other piece of this too is like we've seen the examples of people in the past, right? So when you look at the Joe Rogans, Tim Ferriss's, you know, kind of all the way down the line, the friction for them to get started was very high. To your point, now there's tools available where this is very simple. I mean, you go set up a Substack, right? You use Zoom for podcasts, like it's very, very simple to get started here. What I do think is interesting to kind of contemplate is before somebody gets started or as you're getting started, it's what are you optimizing for as well, right? So if somebody says to me, hey, I would love to just write the email every day, right? Or the newsletter, or the blog, or, you know, whatever it is. And that's all I want to do. Like I have no ambition to do anything other than that. I want to basically be able to provide for my family. And outside of that, like everything else is a fool's game. I just want to be happy. That is a fantastic life to live, right? And by the way, probably makes you one of the smartest people in the world if that's your perspective, you know, on life. But that will require a certain amount of work and a certain type of work that is very different than somebody who says, hey, I want to build a very large audience. I want to monetize it along the way. And then I basically want to build companies and products to sell through to that audience that I have a relationship with. Right? That's a much more kind of grandiose type ambition. That's going to require a team. That's going to require all these different things. And so you're going to do a different type of work and a different process to that work to kind of optimize for that second example. And so you don't have to have all the answers, right? But I do think that kind of people just asking themselves, okay, I'm going to go do this. What do I want it to be today? And that can change in the future, but like, what is that goal or what am I optimizing for? And what it does is it just gives you something to shoot for. Right. And it kind of helps you make decisions kind of from there. And I don't see enough people doing that. I actually made a lot of the same mistakes. Like I used to not ask myself those questions. Now that I do, it's proven to be very, very helpful. So I think other people can benefit from it.
I think you're totally right. I think summarizing that, when it comes to building an audience and monetizing an audience, it's easy to start specific and then be a generalist. And the mistake people make is they start off being a generalist, which is writing about like anything that they're interested about, or I mean, making content, let's just say that, about anything that they're interesting about. Whereas the way I always try to explain it is the more generic you are, then the easier you are to replace. And the only thing that you can do to stand out from the next person is be cheaper. Because if there's a million generic things, what are you going to do? You're going to choose the cheapest one, right? Where if you can be like an authority, even in an industry that isn't huge in terms of the people that, in terms of like the size of the audience, you're still better off picking something, building your reputation, and then becoming a generalist in time. So I think that's great advice.
Absolutely. I think that you nailed it.
Great. Okay. So let's finish off with something that I am always conflicted about. One, because it's been a personal battle in my head of the direction that I want to go with my own personal work, but two, simply because of the practicality of the business model. So Substack is a subscription newsletter. You provide free content and then you offer other content for people that want to pay for the subscription. I think that model is really cool because for people that don't want to create products, that just want their content itself to be the product, it provides a really, really good infrastructure for them. It does make me nervous though, because I feel like there's a limit, it doesn't quite scale the same way that just having one single product that you can sell like an infinite amount of times are. So I'm not even necessarily saying that I have an opinion on it. I'm just looking for your insight on this new wave of subscription-based newsletters and what you think is exciting about them and what you think is potentially a detriment about them.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed kind of a big piece of the equation, right? It's just if you want to kind of create once, sell a million times, writing a newsletter is not going to be the thing for you, right? You have to write it on some periodic basis. Now, you don't have to do it daily. You could do it weekly, monthly, whatever you can get your audience to agree to in terms of that kind of subscription, promise, if you will. With that said, what I laugh a lot about is like everyone wants to compare subscription to ads, right? Or subscription monetization through like, I should sell a product. But why can't you just do it all? Right. And I almost look at it more, again, it goes back to like, what do you want to do? If you just want to write a newsletter every day and figure out how to make a living off of it, like that's a perfectly fine and admirable thing to go do. Substack's great for that. Right. But if you want to have diversified revenue streams and kind of all these different things and build like a much more scalable business, maybe you have aspirations to sell it one day, like don't just pick, okay, I'm going to only do subscription or I'm only going to do this one thing, right? You actually want to have kind of that diversification in those revenue streams. And so have a subscription newsletter. Maybe what you do is you say, hey, I'm going to send it a certain number of days behind the paywall. Certain number of days, I'm going to send it outside of the paywall. I'm going to put ads in the one that goes outside the paywall, right? And then, by the way, I have a merchandise section in the email, and therefore you can buy merchandise from me. And, oh, I'm coming out with this product in partnership with a company. And it's like all this stuff. And what it boils down to, and I think is so interesting about the conversation right now, is everyone's looking at these newsletter writers as writers. And I'm saying, no, the creators are just the new small business.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if you're an entrepreneur, again, you can have a small business or a big business, right? Some people are perfectly happy. They work from 9 to 5 every day. They run let's say a corner store, and they go to work, they do their job. They have no aspiration whatsoever to go and get a second, third, fifth location. That's fine, right? They provide for their family and they're happy.
Sounds
awesome
so
life.
Nice.
Yeah, awesome life. But if you're the person who's like, I want to have a national chain, right? Different type of person, usually different type of body of work. And so I think the same thing with this newsletter stuff is just like, it is entrepreneurship. It may not feel like that because it's so easy to get started. And the production of the product is writing. So it's like anyone can do it, whether you're a good writer or not. But going back to like, it's entrepreneurship. And so all the same principles apply. All the kind of variation or spectrum of ambition applies. And I think when people kind of start thinking of it less about like, I talked earlier about like the TikTok influencer, can we talk about them as entrepreneurs? Well, same thing here is like, rather than talk about it as a newsletter writer, what if we start talking about it as entrepreneurs? Right. Then all of a sudden it puts it in a different light. It starts to open up the possibility. And I think that like mental expansion of what could happen becomes really, really interesting for the people who are in those roles.
Yeah. And I love the fact that you mentioned that the first battle is basically deciding what you want. A lot of times I forget that most of the world isn't kind of psychopathic like me, and I get the feeling like you are too, where no matter what you do, there's always new ideas and like other shit you could be doing or other places that you could expand upon. And if your ambition is just to do a little bit of writing every day and maybe make a little bit of money, then just do that and just be happy with that. But I think what you're saying, which I really relate to, is that there's a world of possibilities out there. And I think the trap that a lot of people fall into is just the idea of comparison. I thought it was really important what you said, where like my first day might look very similar to your first day, and comparing what you're doing now to people that have been doing it 2 or 3 years is just like a really great way to get down on yourself. And I think that's an important message as well. Great. All right, man. Well, wrapping this up, one more real quick question for you. With everything that you have going on, for my curiosity, I want to know, what is the stuff that's boiling right now in the back of your brain saying like, this newsletter, my personal podcast, this new podcast, your fund, your digital investment group, like, is this all coming to some kind of head 5 to 10 years down the lane? Like, what are you working on, man?
I don't know. That's the short answer. I don't have a master plan.
Nice.
I got a whole bunch of ideas about all the different ways that it could go, but I try to really optimize for optionality, because it's kind of, the world changes so fast, right? The market changes so fast. My personal desires change so fast, right? Last year I wasn't married. I'm married now, right? Like, just simple things like that can really kind of change your priorities and things like that. You don't want to get locked in like, hey, this is what I'm doing, right? Or this is kind of the master plan. And so for me, what I'm ultimately optimizing for is happiness. And that happiness is usually attached to optionality. Do I want to do this today? No. Okay, I'm not going to do it. Right. And so I think that that's kind of my guiding principle. That scares the hell out of some people. Like, some people really want to have the concrete plan. I wrote it down in a notebook and I look at it every day. It's just never been me. And so I think it's just kind of just do what's authentically you, right? And you'll tend to be in a pretty good spot.
Amazing, brother. Great advice. Great way to wrap this up. Okay, let's do the traditional end of podcast. Where can we find you? It's it's pomp.substack.com. Tell
Yeah.
people they can find
So easy URL is just pompletter.com. It takes you to pomp.substack.com. And then you just find me on Twitter at @Pompliano, and pretty much tweet everything from there. So should be good.
Amazing. All of that will be linked on the show notes of the podcast itself and also the show notes of the blog. Anthony, I really appreciate your time, man. It was a pleasure speaking to you. Like I said before, I'm a big fan of your work. Best of luck with everything you got going on, and let's keep in touch.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks so much.
All right, homie.